Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie. And we're all fighting for one.
Welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Team Made Apart podcast is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2, relationships squared. Also, financial support comes from teammadeapart.com. Leveraging 20 plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Team Made Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Team Made Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammadeapart.com/talent. That's teammadeapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our Happy Little Podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammadeapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be made in any amount and would go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammadeapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thanks in advance for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Hey there, and welcome to the Season 3 finale of the Team Made Apart podcast. I just wanted to take a quick moment and thank everyone who's participated in the show this season, both guests and listeners who've been willing to share the good work we're doing here with their friends, families, professional networks, and hopefully anyone who could benefit from the perspectives and knowledge shared by our contributors. Hot off the heels of COVID, I think that this show and others like it, and the individuals who've joined us here to share their great wells of knowledge, have done a real service to a world experiencing drastic change. And I am thrilled to add the voice of today's guest to the soapbox from which we've been shouting. Today's special guest is the incredible John Riordan. John is the Director of Support at Shopify, Chairman at Grow Remote, and a figure with a well-documented history of making impactful contributions to the world of remote work. John's prior employers are a veritable who's who of progressive companies with whom he's been wildly influential on their integration of remote work strategies. From US Airways to Virgin Atlantic to Apple and now Shopify, his experience as a results-oriented international customer service leader have proven invaluable in showing how remote work works at scale. John joins us today for a much-needed and much-anticipated conversation about intentionality and how it can make or break a company's approach to remote work, developing a culture of trust on distributed teams, how the role of remote team leaders have evolved rapidly in recent years, and so much more. Please join me in welcoming to the show our guest, John Riordan. Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, Ryan, how you doing?
Very well. Grateful to have you here. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is a much anticipated conversation. I think we've been going back and forth for maybe a little over a year at this point, trying to make this happen. And so I'm just thrilled to death to have you here and very grateful for it.
Apologies that it's taken so long to get to here, but let's make the most of it.
Absolutely. Well, first things first, I've been trying to get into the habit. I'm getting about a 50% rate of return on this, but where are you calling in from today?
I'm usually based in Cork in Ireland, which is on the south coast of Ireland, but I'm fortunate enough that I have access to, my mother has a summer house right out on the edge of the Atlantic, overlooking the Atlantic with a beautiful beach view. And I happen to be here at the moment for a couple of weeks. One of the upsides or downsides, whichever way you look at it, the pandemic is working remote and the ability to, in my particular case, I'm trying to stay away from folks and not catch the virus. So I've been, quote unquote, sent here by my wife to look after myself. It's been a really tough, just myself, the dog, a couple of crates of beer, and a laptop and a beautiful view. So it has not exactly been the greatest hardship in the world.
Well, I will say what I love about it is that you're doing the sort of stereotypical nomad thing, right? You're on the beach working, like everybody sees in the pictures. But I don't know that you want to have your toes in that Irish sand right now. I don't know what the weather's like over there. I'm sure it's a beautiful view, but I don't know if it's that tropical beach, everyone.
No, it looks really good, but it would be, a little bit of frostbite.
I love that. Well, hey, let's, I guess, sort of begin at the beginning a little bit. I mean, obviously you have a long history in working remote. I mean, you're a well-known figure in the space, but I don't want to, beat too much on the history of how, we got from A to B, but if you don't mind giving us sort of an abridged version of sort of your history and how you sort of evolved into working in remote, with remote work at all.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of happened by chance. It was around, I think it was 2000, just after 9/11. So it was late 2001. I was with Virgin Atlantic, and we had a significant challenge ahead of us, which was stripping out about 25% of the cost structure of the company, as all airlines were at the time. And one of the single biggest personnel costs was the support organization. Now, what your listeners need to recognize and understand was that a lot of the calls that were taking place in airline support in those days were really no value calls. At the time, there was a seemingly perceived value, but when you look at it from today's viewpoint, you can understand how they were of no value. They were seat assignments, meals, reconfirming flights, all sorts of really crappy non-revenue additional calls. So one of our challenges was how do we actually take those out of the network and out of the system and actually do it cheaper? I happened to be at an event, and I overheard someone talking about remote work, got involved in the conversation. And as I was driving home that night, having kind of laughed off this remote work as it'll never work type of thing, the classics, I was the classic sort of doubting Thomas. And as I was driving home that night, I was driving back from Boston to Connecticut, and I thought, hang on a second, there's something nagging me. This sounds really clever, really interesting. By the time I got home, I was really curious. I ended up contacting the company that was referenced in the call, in the conversation. And over the course of the next 6 months, I kept on trying to find, I was trying to find the catch. And I kept on saying to the sales guy, what's the catch? And I couldn't find a catch. And the real gotcha for me was when I went and actually participated in one of the online training classes, and I saw how well the folks were being trained. So we ended up at Virgin Atlantic outsourcing our customer support organization to a company that was using remote workers as a trial. But the trial was wildly successful, and that sort of whetted my appetite on remote work. Rolled the clock forward about 4 years, and a little company in Cupertino in California, Apple, was planning a couple of years in advance for the rollout of the iPhone, and was looking for a scalable customer support model. Remote work was on the horizon. They weren't quite sure how to do it. My name was surfaced at Apple. I ended up getting a phone call. They asked me if I'd like to talk to them, so I did. And I took a gamble and went and worked on a contract basis for Apple. And the very first remote call by an agent working for Apple was about 13 months before the iPhone launch. So that's the level of prep that Apple was doing at that stage. I didn't even know what we were prepping for. I knew it was something interesting. And so Apple launched then. So that was in May 2006. And if you think of it now, 15 years later, Apple probably has worldwide about 30,000 is my guess, folks who work from home, be it as employees of the company or with their outsourced partners. So from that tiny little acorn, a very large oak tree grew.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I think it's really interesting too, because I mean, you sort of progressed through a time, this is the way I always describe my career and my relationship, like with the internet and stuff, is that in the early days of my youth, in order to be online, you had to learn how to program, right? You learned a little bit of coding and stuff like that, because if you wanted to be online, that's how it was done. And so I had the opportunity to sort of, bridge the gap between, drag and drop solutions we have today and back in the olden days of actually hard coding everything. You are sort of explaining that same transition, but as it pertains to remote work. Obviously there have been iterations of remote work, almost as long as we've had the internet. But this idea of it becoming sort of mainstream and part of what we do, as part of our daily routine, it's certainly been a transition. So it's really cool to hear you sort of recount all those steps along the way. One
other fun thing about that was when I was doing the investigative work in, I think this would have been 2002 to 2003. It was called telecommuting. It wasn't remote work. And when you think of it, it's such an antediluvian dinosaur expression, telecommuting. Yeah. But that's what it was. And there was actually a National Telecommuting Association.
Oh, how funny. Yeah, no, I think that was one of those indicators of the future back, 20, 30 years ago, was when you could mush words together like that and make these little hybrids that sounded technologically advanced. So I think that was the move then, but I just love that. So one of the things that's sort of resonating with me or popping out of this conversation, though, is you're talking about the different things that the organizations were doing, and especially in your memory of working with Apple. They were super intentional about the kind of work that they were doing. This was something that they were putting serious thought in, serious dollars behind, serious money into. And, obviously they're hoping to be efficient and save money down the road and, get a return on this, but nonetheless, they're being wildly intentional about it. And I know that this, right now during sort of, we're for most of us, we're coming off sort of the heels of COVID. Hopefully most people are starting to get back to some semblance of what it was to be, I guess, normal, quote unquote, normal. And, so I'm thinking that there are so many companies that were forced to go remote during this period of sort of turmoil during the pandemic that maybe they didn't have the opportunity to be intentional. And I'm afraid that might have led to some bad experiences with remote work. So I wonder if you just talk a little bit about sort of, how important, intentionality is in setting up a remote workforce.
First of all, I don't even know if it's a word, but we will go with the word intentionality. But we'll leave it at that. It's a word it's oft used, whether it's a word or not.
I'm a notorious maker-upper of words, so I'll take it either way.
There you go. You're a maker-upper of intentionality, words like intentionality. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting one, Ryan, because companies who are working from home right now, the vast majority of them did not set out to do this intentionally. And what I would urge people to recognize is that what they're experiencing right now is survival in a pandemic and trying to work from home, juggling care, juggling education, juggling a pretty crappy home office setup in a lot of instances. That is not intentional working from home. If you set out to intentionally work from home, you're going to have a really strong professional home office setup. And that's very different. And I would urge people to those people who have been, let's say, forced out of the office to work from home, split into two groups, one who've really enjoyed it and the second group who haven't. So let's say the folks who've really enjoyed it, please understand that you're enjoying the output and you're enjoying a lot of the benefits of it, but it can get a whole hell of a lot better when you add levels of intentionality to it. For those people who haven't enjoyed it and haven't really seen the proper experience, I would urge them to actually look at how it can be done intentionally and don't rush to judge until you've actually been in a fully intentional work from home scenario. Now, I do also want to recognize that working from home or working remotely is not for everybody, and it's not for every industry. So, some people try to make this a black and white issue. It isn't. And we're going to see a significant migration back into offices. we're going to see companies, and we always see this, Ryan, with a pendulum swing, right? When everybody says, oh, we're all going to work from home, a smart company out there will hang their shingle out and say, oh no, we're going to be office based, so that they can actually attract a rich seam of talent of people who are deliberately saying, I absolutely want to work in an office. So you got to understand that pendulum swing. But let's talk about this big body in the middle. There's a large group of people who've seen the benefits of working from home. And those people are going to be the ones who are going to decide what level the future of homework will be. Will it be, a 3-day a week? Will it be, I know it's a much overused word, the hybrid model, but what level of a hybrid model will exist in the future? My personal opinion is that the genie is out of the bottle. The outcome and the output of people working from home can never be, no leader is ever going to be able to say it can't work and it doesn't work, so I'm never going to let it be, that idea be floated again. Because after all, a lot of people have spent 12, 13, 14 months working from home, and a lot of most businesses have stayed open, so it actually has worked. So it's going to be so fascinating to see which way the pendulum swings. It's not going to be all the way towards remote, but nor is it going to be all the way towards office. I do think somewhere in the middle, but I think, like I'll go back to the comment, the genie is out of the bottle. We know it works. And it's going to be very interesting which side of the 50%, which side of the halfway line it's going to actually, it's going to land.
Yeah, I think you make a great point there. And I love sort of pointing out this fact about, this not being a black and white situation, right? I think, especially when you talk about intention, I think the impulse is to think that you're being intentional for remote, right? You're being intentional for remote, but your intention could be remote doesn't work for me and I prefer to be in the office. And so, you can be intentional in one way or the other. It doesn't mean necessarily take this side. And I think that there is sort of this misnomer out there among sort of, I guess what you would call remote work advocates, this idea that it must be all one way. The future of work is remote and blah, blah, blah. But I think most people actually are more aligned with what you're talking about, sort of this hybrid model, or what people might call flexible work. And it's more about getting, great output from your people and giving them the best opportunity to provide that output versus, saying you must work from an office even if you're underperforming. So I think it's really good to talk about that sort of, gray area that's in the middle there.
Absolutely. And look, at the end of the day, it's exactly what it is. It's a gray area. And it would be a very brave person that will plant a flag and say, I absolutely know what's going to happen in the future. You don't. Let's see how it transpires. But I'll keep on going back to the point. The genie is out of the bottle. We know it works, and how it will develop into the, let's call it the future work palette, is going to be fascinating. And I'll be quite bullish on it and say it's going to be a significant piece of the future, but it's not everything.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there is that distinction too, right? Between people who were in a work from home situation, basically forced by COVID or forced by pandemic to work from home, versus sort of the intentional or the remote worker by choice. And I think that there's a significant difference there also for leaders and for people who are running companies, right? You were put in a situation as a leader, maybe, where all of a sudden you had to figure out how to make everybody work from home, and you bought whatever software or technology you seem to think you might need to, hurry up and get a Band-Aid over this, gaping wound. But the, reality of the situation is now things have settled. We seem to have a little bit more bearing. Of course, it's still wildly unknown what the future holds, but, we feel to at least have our bearings back a little bit. We sort of know which way is north, and we can start maybe directing our company again. And I think it would be foolish to sort of just out of hand say, okay, well, remote work doesn't work. We tried it and it sucked. Because I think the reality is, you were put in a weird pickle. This idea that work from home is remote work is not, they're not congruent. And so I think, as it pertains also to intention, this idea for remote or for leaders of either presently co-located teams who are looking to have remote work, or people who are looking to go hybrid and sort of, fulfill the wishes of those who wish to stay remote, those kinds of people. This level of intention is more than just at the level of the worker. It's, at the level of the employer. How do we build a better company? How do we make better opportunity for our people? All that thing. And how do we do that with intention?
What I would say to pretty much everybody is don't go for the absolute. All right. don't say this is the panacea, but I don't want it to be dismissed either. It really is. It's interesting because I'll give you a really simple example. It irks me when I hear people say, the only way, this tends to be how it's phrased, is the only way that people are going to understand a company culture is when they're in a room together collaborating. Well, that's really interesting. So tell that to, and you could list off 100 companies, a couple hundred companies worldwide who have started just since the pandemic, who have built a remote worldwide organization, plus many others who've been doing it for the last 8, 10, 12 years. You can't tell them that they don't have a company culture. But what these people are actually saying is, I don't have it in my wheelhouse to understand how I could replicate the culture that I grew up in. I don't know how to replicate that in a remote world. So how they phrase it is, it doesn't work or it can't work. And what really people need to be a lot more honest and say, I'm not sure how this could work, but I'm going to lean in and go and find out, is it possible that it could work? That is the magic. And if people will actually lean in and find that out and reach out to people who've got expertise in this and be curious, I think it's going to be a very interesting development over the next 5 years.
Yeah, it's one of the things I've been saying, during this crisis, is that we're really going to see, especially as it pertains to remote work, you're really going to see where great leaders lie, right? You're going to find out who's good and who's bad, because, you're going to have situations like this where people are just dug in that this is how it's going to be. We've always done it this way. This is how it must be, race back to the office as soon as we can get there, that kind of, I guess, sort of, not very pliable thinking. Versus, the leaders who are a little bit more adaptable, who are curious and learning the new situations. How do we grow? How do we adapt? And I'll stop beating the horse with the word intention. It's actually become a bit of a drinking game on the show this year because we've said it so often. But a big part of remote leadership is being intentional. And I think part of being intentional is being open to new ideas, right? I mean, it's exactly what you were just saying, is that if you hope to lead a team that is either distributed now or might be in the future, even partially, setting yourself up with the intention of, not only serving them better, but all the things that come with being intentional in your work, developing greater levels of trust and, more transparency and all these things that are the sort of the buzzy terms for remote leaders. It ultimately makes you a better leader, whether you're co-located or not. It's a great thing for people.
Another way to look at it is as a leader, it's probably the most challenging thing is a cataclysmic change like this, a massive, tectonic plate shift of a change that happened pretty much overnight without much advance warning. And the challenge is, I've got to change how I operate as a leader. And there are people who will struggle to adapt, and there are people who will do it so seamlessly. And I think every organization needs to recognize that it doesn't make somebody a great leader if they're able to change like overnight, but it doesn't necessarily make somebody a bad leader if they're struggling with the change. And I think organizations need to be empathetic and help their leaders along that learning curve so that they understand that, look, it's like everything. Change is difficult. It's very difficult to tell somebody, who's been a leader for 25 years and where their domain is standing up from their desk and looking out at the people that work for them, and they're able to, there's an element of command and control there. How do I take the things that I need to get done and get it done in a different way that's not sort of that command and control, presenteeism, or not presenteeism, but let's say, imposing my presence upon those in front of me. How do I do that through a small little screen like this, and do it maybe not by speaking, but maybe doing it through asynchronous communication? That's a huge change for people. And it's important that organizations give their leaders a chance to actually adapt. So training organizations are going to need to change that skill set, because there's no point in throwing out, throwing out a whole layer of leadership. That's not the issue. It's how do you work with your leadership team to get them to adapt to these new circumstances? That's a huge challenge for every org.
Yeah, one of the things too that I've been sort of espousing during this whole period is that, basically everybody has experienced trauma now. We're all recoverers. We're all recovering from the trauma of COVID, whether you lost people or whether you were just strictly tied up in your house or whatever. So I hear all these people shouting about the new normal and get back to normal and all that stuff. And I think it does a real disservice to people who have suffered, right? I mean, basically everybody who's coming back to work is now a trauma victim. And so I think that, maybe now more than ever, these levels of trust and empathy and things like that are becoming more and more important. And so I wonder if we can maybe transition our conversation a little bit to just talking about that trust and how we can really go forward in developing a deep trust, with teams that we're working with remotely.
Trust is the absolute and utter oil in the engine. If it isn't there, the company's not, the division, the department, the company is not going to be able to work remotely. Pure and simple. So I always say to people, remember the time when you sat in an office and you passed over the contract to the person when you were hiring them. The feeling that you had that this is the right person coming in, you trusted them completely. Now, mind you, in the old days, we then tended to be quite pedantic and quite prescriptive as to what we needed people to do, because they were right in front of us and they might run into the office and you tell them what to do. In the virtual world or in the remote world, it's quite different. It's really a case of trusting somebody to do the work, handing out the work assignment, and there's a bit of give and take in that, and the work comes back and it becomes output based, as opposed to, let's say, somebody being able to tell you that they're doing the work. It's really a case of, is the work done or not? And that's a very, very simple, it's such a tiny thing, but those folks who have worked in an office and are now working remote will get the point. It's not about telling your boss that it's nearly done. It kind of is or it isn't. And there's a level of BS, I think, that's been stripped away by the communication methods that we're using right now. So to me, it's a slightly purer form. And I think it's more output based. And that's where, like, organizations that are able to really double down on trust are getting the rewards very, very quickly, because they're actually trusting their employees. Look, there's a very simple, anybody who's read Daniel Pink, there's a really interesting piece on in the book Drive, and he talks about the three most important intrinsic motivators are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And once you give people a level of autonomy, which is essentially where trust is massively important, you enable them to master their craft, and you set them up with the purpose of the company or the division. You're going to get the greatest level of value from somebody, because you will actually tap into that intrinsic drive that people have. So really, it is all about autonomy, but the foundation of autonomy is trust. You must trust that people will get the job done.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say too, even as an extension of this, like maybe the two-way street version of trust is this idea of psychological safety. And it's this idea of building an environment that not only do I trust you, my employer, you trust me, the employee, but we have this sort of two-way conversation where we're free to make comments and we're free to talk. And we've cultivated this culture that allows this two-way conversation, and we feel safe doing it. Myself, I've worked in situations where, it doesn't feel particularly safe to say what's on top of your mind. Right. And I mean, maybe, we need to have a little, a little self-control and not go too nuts and say everything that comes to mind. But at the same time, I think being in an operation or in an environment where you have this, I guess, sort of built-in security where you don't feel like you're going to be run off at any given time certainly could contribute to trust, if not maybe as sort of the whole thing.
Well, I think I'm going to say exactly what you said in a slightly different way. The counterbalancing element for trust is vulnerability. And if you as a leader are willing to show a level of vulnerability, you're actually doubling down on the trust, right? Because you have to have that. It's a little bit of a give and take. If you trust people, but you maintain the kind of command and control vision of the world where I'm omnipotent and I'm always right, that's not really setting a proper trusting environment. Telling people that you absolutely screwed up or that you're having an absolutely crappy day might not have been in your wheelhouse 5 years ago in an office-based world. But once you're suddenly in this remote world and you're dealing with people in a very different way, I think it comes a lot more naturally to people to actually counterbalance that trust with vulnerability and be a lot more open. I've seen it happen in the last 2 organizations that I've been in from a remote perspective, that vulnerability is the perfect counterweight for trust.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's right. I think vulnerability too. And for many, maybe you're going to misconstrue this idea of being vulnerable in meaning that you must, air your dirty laundry in the room or whatever. But ultimately what we're talking about is being, open and honest in conversation and in practice. You see, especially, is more common in remote companies, it seems, than in other types. But you often see, payroll is out in the open, and, all our documentation is out in the open, and all our, meetings and everything. Like, there's no secrets. We're not hiding things. And, that's an example of being vulnerable, quote unquote, vulnerable, in that you're sort of pulling back the curtain and letting people see what's going on, even if it doesn't necessarily mean an emotional vulnerability. But to your point, I think that the emotional bit, too, being able to just sort of express your humanness among other humans is, critical in developing not just good work relationships, but relationships in general, human relationships.
Well, there's one aspect of this as well that kind of goes without saying, and it's an adjunct to the point you just made, which is, and it's kind of leading on to the next topic, which is leadership, is if you're not looking after yourself first, and for example, the classic airline thing about putting your own oxygen mask on first, right? If you're not looking after yourself first, you're not able to help everybody else. But to actually explain to people what you're doing and that you are actually, hang on, I am now, like, metaphorically speaking, I am putting on the oxygen mask so that I can help you guys. It's a really strong symbol of trust. And, I think it's one of the most important things from a leadership perspective, is the trust, the vulnerability, and I think you referenced it there, the transparency. You put all those together, and we're now building up that leadership palette in a far stronger way.
Yeah, we always use the examples of, being willing to show your belly, sort of evolutionarily speaking, was a sign of being vulnerable. And then this concept of sort of breaking bread, right? You hear this old phrase, breaking bread, but the idea is that you're, basically proving to your counterpart that you're not going to poison them, right? You're being vulnerable, you're being open. And I think that is critical of leaders. And so maybe, as you alluded to, it sort of segues nicely into this conversation about how remote leadership has changed. Obviously, people have been doing this for a long time. There are a number of companies that are doing it rather successfully at this moment. But, obviously there is a lot of stuff happening in our world right now. What do you, I guess, if you had a finger up in the air and you were testing the winds, how do you see things moving around, and how is leadership evolving in remote agencies?
It's evolving slowly. I think we saw a sudden knee-jerk reaction to it. And there, like as I referenced earlier on, there's some people jumped into it very quickly and made a very strong, made a really, really good effort to learn as much as they could as quickly as possible to try to get the quick sprint into it. Some folks are more of the middle distance runner. They're going to take their time to get it. And then some of the long distance ones are going to take a long time to really, truly evolve. And that's okay. So as a senior leader in a company, you've got to understand that people will come to the pace of this remote work at very different speeds, and that is okay. and you have to evolve your leadership style based upon people's speed of acceptance and speed of recognition of that. So that, I think that's the first thing is the acceptance of reality. This is not a magic switch that you can just run around. I'm going to turn the on-off button on the back of everybody, and now they're suddenly available, and they're now totally different people, and they've gone from being unwoke to being woke. No, it just doesn't. It just simply just doesn't work like that. So from a leadership perspective, to me, that's the most important thing. And then I'm just going to reiterate the points. I know to bore the pants off you, I'm going to reiterate the points of trust, and the other one I'm going to add in is the communication. Doubling down on communication is probably the most important thing that people will need to do from a leadership perspective. Now, I'm going to actually bifurcate the communication thing for a second. What some people hear when they hear communication, how it translates to them is, I need to be on Zoom calls 7 or 8 hours a day. I need to be constantly communicating with my people. No. You can't do that. You will absolutely fry your brain if you are nonstop 7, 8, 9 hours a day on Zoom calls. You don't have the time to get the work done, right? And I think from a communication perspective, to me, the most important part of communication is to have a couple of gaps during the day, intentional spaces in the day where you're able to get a few things done. And you tell people openly, transparently, I do it myself. I have at the end of the last half hour of every morning, it's when I catch up on email and Slack, period. And I just don't waver on that at any stage. And that's a very important point, because it gives me a little bit of a stepping stone to get stuff done. It gives me a break. And then I regularly put in 2 to 4 hour blocks of time for focus. Just put in my calendar focus time. Now, I do routinely schedule people in for calls when there's stuff that's urgent, but I try as best I can to keep those times available to actually do some sort of deep work, which you need to do from time to time. So I'd say from a leadership perspective, don't get drunk on the need to show that you are ridiculously productive and that you're on, 8 hours of Zoom calls a day, 5 days a week, and you're gonna fry yourself, you're gonna harm yourself, and you're actually going to drag the productivity of your team down. So you need to be smart and build time in and lead properly, lead by example.
Yeah, there's a couple things in there that I'd like to unpack that I really like. I mean, one is this idea of more communication. And I think more communication, like you said, for some might mean, lots of Zoom meetings or whatever. But I think really what we were trying to say is better communication, right? And we get to better communication through the other things that you were just describing, which is sort of organizational and again, intentional structure to your day and your life and all that stuff. And, I mean, it's a well-known problem in sort of remote work communities that people have a really hard time shutting off, and they have a hard time putting up boundaries and these kinds of things. So if as a leader, you can, model by example that you have specific times for specific things, and we only hold certain kinds of meetings at certain times, and, expectations around who needs to attend or who needs to do what to prepare for that meeting, all those sorts of things being set out in advance, those different strategies, or I guess maybe tactics for how to be a good remote worker, not only benefit you as the leader, but can, trickle downhill and sort of lead by example, show these people how to make a better situation for themselves, and so I think that's critical.
Recognition of time zones. I mean, by virtue of more companies being remote, there are going to be more time zones involved, significantly more time zones involved, which means that from a leadership perspective, you need to be a little bit more cognizant of other people's time and recognizing that you can't and shouldn't impinge upon people's personal time. I have no problem whatsoever a couple of days a week when I do it with intention. I will work Eastern Standard, work a different day, basically I'll start 5 hours later than my time here in Ireland, and I'll do that from time to time just so that I have a full day with the team that's based on the East Coast. But I do that because it actually helps me, and I do it to kind of reach. It's sort of an olive branch as well, and it's to show that I'm participating. But it affords me the opportunity then to start my day at 12 noon or 1 p.m. Now, I could be a little bit idiotic about it and get up at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning and try to jam in 5 hours worth of work. Or I could do the smart thing and actually go and smell the roses, go out, go walk the dog, go play golf, go for a bike ride. That's the smart thing that you need to do, is to actually build in some of those opportunities for you to do the smart thing. Another thing, when we talked about communication, not all communication is a meeting, okay? Not all communication is sending an email. And I would urge people as well to recognize that different people learn different ways and different people take messaging different ways. And there are some teams where a quick 3 or 4 minute recorded video to a large team that can be sent out and watched asynchronously can be significantly more advantageous to a company than than waiting 3 weeks to get the right moment, to get the half hour where you've got the folks in New Zealand and the folks in Ireland and the folks in Canada, and you get them all together. No. A very simple 5 or 10 minute, well recorded, well scripted message from a leader or a group of leaders can actually be infinitely more impactful. And it also is a documentation of the record, and it's something that people can go back to. So it's just a different form of communication. It's something we would never have done it's unlikely that we would have been comfortable doing it 18 months ago. But now we've become a lot more comfortable with it. So see the possibilities in actually advancing those levels of those communication methods to get the most out of them.
Yeah, well, and what I love about the idea of using video specifically is you can do so much more to head off sort of emotional problems that rise from misreading a text or misinterpreting punctuation or whatever. And you can take an email the wrong way, even if it's meant from a good spot. Where if you have a video, you're layering on so many additional details. The way you looked when you said it. Where were your eyebrows? All this kind of stuff. You can provide all these extra cues that I think make the communication just that much slicker.
Yeah. So there's so many different ways, or so many new things that we're now getting used to that weren't part of our structure, 18 months ago, that we need to be cognizant of, and we need to use them to our best advantage. Like I'll be really frank. I was not a user of quick video bites. It just wasn't something that I was comfortable doing. And I'm now much more comfortable doing it. It's not my absolute forte. It's not what I do first and foremost, but there's a time and a place where it works really, really well.
Yeah. And I've even seen some software solutions. Like I think it's called Tandem is one of these. That's almost like an instant messaging type solution, but you can do it with video. And, just sort of transcribe your instant video instead of sending a text. And I just love it for that purpose. I think I'm probably a little bit more like you. Like I don't lean into being on camera any more than I really have to be. But I can definitely see how just being able to sort of say what you're thinking, communicate what you mean, do all that stuff in one quick 30-second bite, rather than trying to be really articulate in your writing or something, could not only be a time saver, but also maybe, reduce headaches or problems in communication.
Can I just raise one other thing as well? And I say this whimsically, and not to denigrate anybody who's listening, but there are plenty of people complaining about, let's call it Zoom fatigue. All right. But let's just unpack that for a second. A year and a half ago, were people complaining about, I've got meeting fatigue. I'm in the office, I've got meeting fatigue, or I've got people fatigue? No, they weren't. So why are they having Zoom fatigue, right? Or why they didn't? And it's really a case of, I've come across some change. I'm not that comfortable with it. It was kind of forced on me. I'm not that comfortable with it. This is a technology that I'm still becoming comfortable. I'm still not used to, so I'm not that comfortable with it. So you've got all these potential roadblocks as to why it's not that comfortable, and you find you're doing it for 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And maybe one of the things that you've also begun to realize is that you're probably a whole lot better off and more productive with 4 to 5 hours of really deeply intentional meetings. And then, like I said earlier on, having blocked time where you can actually get your work done so that you don't end up complaining about Zoom fatigue. So when people talk about it, I actually start smiling, because I think that's somebody who has not actually planned their day correctly, and they're allowing other people. To me, it's almost like people saying, "Oh, I get too much email." No, you haven't learned to manage your email properly yet. So when people come and say to me, I have Zoom fatigue or I've video meeting fatigue, like, maybe you're not saying no often enough. Maybe you're spending too much time. Maybe that 1 hour meeting could really have been a 5-minute video segment. Like, we've got to think critically and do things in a little bit more productive manner.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And actually, I mean, back to the idea we were talking about earlier about just sort of, remote work hygiene, the ability to, manage your notifications and set boundaries. I think that this is another one of those things, right? Where if you're sloppy about it, and I think that, just given how easy it is technology wise to allow people into our calendars and allow people into our whatever, it's very easy to sort of give up your freedom and feel like you're being pulled 1,000 directions all the time. And so I don't know how much of the fatigue comes from the video call itself versus how much just comes from sort of the mental, stretch of being pulled from here to there to everywhere, and being prepared to, get online and talk, and people are going to see your face. So you can't sit and scribble notes while you're talking. And, I think there's a lot more to it than just the simple act of sitting on camera and talking.
Yes, somebody said recently, don't tell me what your priorities are. Show me your calendar and I'll tell you what your priorities are. I challenge people to actually share their calendar with, at Shopify, we have our calendars open so people can see, what we're doing. You can make it private if you want to, but I have mine at public. And it's a great opportunity for my team. Again, it goes back to the point of transparency and vulnerability. It's great for my direct reports and anybody to look and see what I'm doing. I mean, I've always got the opportunity to turn a meeting to private, but it's a way to show people what my priorities are. Now, could I do a better job? Of course I could. but at least I'm making an effort to be more transparent. And I love when people actually call me out on it and say, look, I noticed you're spending a little bit more time on that. Is that really important? It's like, oh, I actually hadn't looked at it like that.
Yeah, well, and what I like about it too is by being open and transparent with your schedule, for example, you give people the opportunity to respect your time, right? If your calendar is closed to them and they have no idea what's going on, they're just going to set their meeting, right? They have no idea. Yeah. And maybe, some meeting has to be prioritized and it is going to jump over top of something you've already got scheduled. I mean, sometimes these things will happen in a workplace for sure. But the idea is by being open and transparent, not only are you being vulnerable and sharing your details so people can understand how you prioritize things, but you are giving them an opportunity to react to that and say, okay, well, I can see, God, he's really busy every Tuesday. Okay, I'm not going to schedule things on Tuesdays because I happen to know John is slammed on Tuesdays. So Wednesdays, though, he always has this block of time that nothing's going on. Okay, so every time I need him, we're going to hit him up on Wednesday. And I think it gives people, back to this idea of intention, the opportunity to be more intentional on how they're working with you.
Well, and different companies take different approaches to putting in blocks of time. I'll give you just a simple one from a Shopify perspective. And this predated the pandemic by probably 2 years. I think it was somewhere in the middle of 2017. A decision was made that people were spending too much time in meetings, and they couldn't possibly get their jobs done because they were in meetings so often that Wednesdays were deemed no meeting Wednesdays. And suddenly we were encouraged / forced to actually eliminate all meetings on Wednesday. And Wednesday is the time when you actually put your head down and get some work done. Now, some companies would consider that to be a little bit of a bizarre approach, but I personally have found it to be incredibly helpful. And it's when that's when you sit down and write stuff. That's when you start doing the strategic stuff. It's when you start doing, it's when you start doing career planning for your direct reports, when you actually sit down and intentionally look out the window and actually start thinking about the things that you should be doing. Again, this is all manageable. It's just we're in a different world, and you need to kind of turn it upside down a few times, give it a shake, and actually see what works best for you and for your company.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, as we're talking, it's occurring to me, I mean, I think one of the things that happens with more transparency, more open, honest discussion, more, vulnerability, all the things we've been digging into, is that we begin building better relationships with the people we work with. And it seems that this sort of vertical hierarchy that you think of in a traditional office environment, where you've got your C-suite up here and your VPs and your whomever, it seems to sort of level that playing field a little bit. There's still, I think, needs to be a little bit of built-in hierarchy, if for no other reason than understanding people's role in a company. But I think that, it becomes maybe more of a really flat pyramid or something instead of this really high vertical tower. And I think that through the techniques we've been talking about, we can foster better relationships. And one of the things that came up during the pandemic that has just had me scratching my head a little bit is trying to understand what the role of the employer is in sort of, I guess, the social well-being of our employee. So, for example, if I'm working for a remote company and I have a boss who I am responsible to or whatever, like at what point do we draw the line between what the company should be providing in terms of our well-being versus what we should be doing for ourselves? And we talked a little bit about sort of some remote work hygiene and things like that, where we can be maybe better about setting boundaries and things like this. But I wonder if you had some insights on just sort of whose role is it to make sure we're happy?
It's both, really. It's both the employee and the employer. And I think it would be so dangerous to say that it's absolutely the employer's responsibility or absolutely the employee's responsibility. Some simple examples. I would expect a good leader to ensure that their team members are taking enough vacation time, that they're taking enough rest, that they're actually that they're not logging in at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night on a consistent basis and burning out. So when you see that happening and you don't do anything about it, and it becomes your responsibility. But it's just something that can be very easily nipped in the bud. Now, from an employee perspective, you got to start off properly. And what I've seen with companies that are intentionally remote, one of the things they talk about in new hire training is the ability to log on and log off and be very deliberate about that and set boundaries. And I think that's one of the things that will change from a learning perspective and from an onboarding perspective is that logging off at the end of the day and turning the laptop off is actually a very important step. Because if you think about it, in days gone by, you did your job at the office. I mean, anybody who says this isn't the case, you and I know they're lying. They did the job in the office. They took the laptop under their arm, off they went home, laptop opened up in the evening time, and they were banging away on the laptop in the evening time. And over time, that's not a productive way to continue to operate. And one of the aspects that the pandemic has actually outed really is this whole concept of never logging off. It really is a massively important thing, because if you don't have time to actually log off, decompress, and relax, you are going to be a lesser version of yourself the following day. And I think so to go back to your question, whose responsibility is it? It has to be both. It's the employee that they set out from the start to be a very productive employee, but to also know where the boundaries are and know that the company will respect you setting your boundaries. And then as a leader, when somebody is not able to self-regulate, that you encourage them, not regulate for them, but you encourage them to self-regulate in a better manner.
Yeah, I love that. And to me too, it seems like this is a I don't know, pretty pivotal or like a huge shift in the way that leadership used to handle business, right? I mean, I come from an industry, advertising, marketing, where, the pat on the back that you get is because you're the guy that worked the 24-hour shift overnight to make sure that the job got done, right? You got your rewards by being the guy that killed yourself. And, and I think, as a guy who's largely been a freelancer most of my career, it's really easy for me to just overwork myself, get to the point where, we come up on a deadline, sure thing, I can do it. And then, over the course of 3 or 4 days, proceed to just make myself sick. And so I really like what you're saying about I guess the role of the employer being there to help people who can't self-regulate, regulate. And I like that idea, but I like it as a helping hand, not as a, I don't know, daddy state. Like, we don't need somebody to actually be a caretaker for us, but I think it is important for companies to be cognizant and provide the tools to help people, do this for themselves. Because I think most people, want to give their all to their job. They want to be good. Most people aren't killing themselves for their job because they're not happy at work. They're doing it because they're trying to do the best work they can do. But I think in those situations, it's a refreshing perspective, especially coming from an employer, this idea that no, you should take some time off. I recognize that you've hurt yourself or killed yourself for this particular task. You know what? Why don't you just take tomorrow off? Relax. Like, I think this whole concept even of, from a leader's perspective, somebody, suggesting that you should take some time off, I think is a new thing.
I think you'll probably find, and I'm just going to make up a fact here, but I think you'll understand where I'm coming from here. It's my perception that companies that are fully remote and are intentionally remote are far more likely to have a flexible vacation policy and a flexible time policy than companies that would have started out in an office-based environment. And that is because they've learned how to both regulate and self-regulate and get the right balance between the two. Like, I know that I spend more of my time now in encouraging people to take vacation. I don't ever remember in an office-based world having to shoo people out to take vacation as much as I'm doing now. I find myself almost patrolling my people's time to make sure that they're getting the correct level of decompression time. I feel more. I think it's more important to me now than it ever was before, because I know that I'm going to get a better version of that person when I can shoo them away for a couple of days. They get a break and they come back. So really, it's a case of getting people to not come to work for a couple of days and getting people to totally switch off. That's the secondary issue. Let's not have the joke of somebody, quote unquote, not working and they're on Slack on their phone the whole time. That doesn't count.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I'm just thinking of my own work history as we're sitting here talking and just thinking about how rigid people were around, you get exactly X number of days. And if you take even an hour to go to a doctor's appointment, by God, you better log that hour, and that needs to be, accounted for. And, it's funny. And it seems that there's a much more progressive shift in leadership that these kinds of things, it's actually bearing out that the truth is you don't actually have to drive people so hard. Like, by backing off and giving them appropriate time for rest and all that kind of stuff, they're actually more productive and they're getting more done. And I think if you're working in a traditional environment where, it's hours based and you just have to come in and log your 8 hours or whatever, and that's how we're measuring your effectiveness, is just that you were here for 8 hours, versus a model which is common in remote work, which is this idea of, output based, where we're actually just measuring you on what you got done. I think that shift is actually facilitating more opportunity for leaders to be more empathetic and to spend more time caring about the people they work with, and recognizing, God, you should take some time off. You haven't had any time off in 2 months or 3 months. It's time for you to take a break. And I think there's some cultural norms to break. And I mean, I can only really speak for sort of, American culture, but I mean, here is a very driven culture. You're rewarded for killing yourself. But I think that there is, a huge shift happening when you go to a version of work that is output driven, and it becomes less important how much time you spent rather than how good is the quality of your output.
Can I burst one more balloon, if you don't mind?
Absolutely.
And that is the concept of networking. Oh, remote work is never going to work because you're never going to be able to build up a network and know who's in your industry. Can I just tell you that in the 14 or 15 months since the pandemic has started, I have been on conference calls and webinars and podcasts with more people from more countries than ever before. I have widened my network considerably. I mean, significantly and considerably, because this world that we're in has less constraints than before, significantly less constraints. And anybody who tells you that, oh, you're not going to be able to build a network if you're not back in an office. Look, there are industries and there are cities and there are jobs within cities, within industries that definitely do require you to have that level of networking. But there's a vast array of jobs that are where you can actually explode the network that you're in and your industry impact and your industry network from the remote corner of Ireland. It's very easy to do. Again, if you sit down and make it a deliberate plan to do it. One of the things that I tend to do on a Sunday morning is I take the business section of the two main newspapers in Ireland, read through everything, and I'd say every single week I would reach out to 2 or 3 different people that I see articles on, and I reach out to them on LinkedIn and, hey, interested in a virtual coffee to have a quick chat. And it is invigorating, it's interesting, it's exciting. Now, I'm fortunate enough that I suppose I'm confident enough in 30 years working that people will see some value in having a chat with me, but I'm also out there to learn from people, to learn what's happening. So I'm continuing to network, and I would encourage anybody and everybody to not accept that you can't network. What I'd ask people to look in the mirror and go, I haven't yet worked out how to network properly, because there is a way to network and do it better than you probably ever have done it before. It might need you to either lean into somebody else and find out what they're doing, or get out of your comfort zone and do it slightly differently, or both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I would speak, in my own experience, literally every job I've ever had, every contract I've ever won, every whatever has come by way of networking. It's come through somebody I knew who introduced me to somebody else. And then I was able to build a relationship with that individual that, yielded some fruit in that sense. And not to say that all your networking has to be results based. Sometimes it can just be for the privilege of knowing somebody, but there really is, people are so much more accessible now than they've ever been. The author of your favorite book, you can reach out to them on LinkedIn or whatever, and maybe they won't respond, maybe you won't get them, but you might. And the odds are getting pretty good. A lot of times you can get a hold of people. Honestly, the way even you and I connected for this call, for example, this came through networking. I talked to guests in my first season and second season of the podcast that were like, oh, you got to talk to John. So I reach out to John, and but this is how it goes. And I think that for, career seekers and people who are working in remote positions now, doing the work now and meeting the people you meet now is what's going to make sure that you have a long-term, healthy, happy career. If this idea or the old model where you used to stay in the same factory for 40 years or whatever is sort of gone. And I think that this idea that, if you're not continually building a network up of good individuals, not only is your life not being as enriched as it could be because there's so many great people in the world to meet, but professionally and everything else, this is how business gets done. As great as technology and everything else is, business gets done through networking.
I'll give you an example. I would expect that there will be some people who listen to what I'm saying in this podcast and think I'm talking complete rubbish, and some people who think that I'm making a ton of sense. And whichever side of the fence you're on, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm quite comfortable and open to have a conversation. I'll have a virtual cup of coffee with anybody and everybody, as long as it's interesting, thought-provoking, and there's a learning opportunity for both people. Absolutely. Why wouldn't you?
Well, and that's the point, right? You never know where the right insight is going to come from, or the right way of thinking about a particular issue. Maybe you're stumped at work and you'll hear the right thing over coffee that changes your whole paradigm or moves you into the right, right career path if you're working somewhere, or, maybe give you the empathy to be a better leader because now you've heard somebody's story and it had a big impact on you or whatever. I think that there's just so much that can become from that. And, to just sort of bring it full circle, we talked about that a little bit at the beginning, just sort of being open to learning and continually trying to grow as an individual, whether it's in a leadership capacity or a worker capacity or whatever, just this continual interest in becoming better or, reinventing ourselves all the time, I think is a critical part of just being human, if, not also a good idea for our professional lives.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Well, cool. So John, we're at the end of our hour. Do you want to take a quick moment, just let people know how they can get in touch with you? You sort of mentioned LinkedIn might be a good way.
I will, and I'll give you a little bit of a caveat on it. If you want to reach out to me and sell your company's products via LinkedIn, you probably won't get a follow back from me. But if you want to reach out for a conversation, absolutely. So I don't view LinkedIn I view LinkedIn as a networking tool, not a lazy salesperson tool. Okay. And I don't mean to offend anybody who uses LinkedIn to build up their prospects, but I don't, that's not how I operate. So I'm available on LinkedIn, easy to find, John Riordan. You got the spelling of the name in the materials in the podcast. It's the easiest way to reach me, and I will take the conversation to email typically fairly quickly. I don't particularly like keeping it in the LinkedIn messaging. That's the easiest way to connect with me. And I love a thought-provoking conversation. I love people telling me that I'm full of crap. And I love people challenging some of the stuff, because you never know how wrong you are or how right you are until you really have a good joust with somebody on a particular topic. So I love that.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought to close on. And I think also, the way that you're handling LinkedIn, I think is probably the right way. I mean, not to get too preachy, but yeah, I mean, I get more of those, automated messages that come over. And I think it sort of kills the purity of what LinkedIn was for a while, which was a great way to connect to one another. And now it's becoming sort of the sales platform. So it's unfortunate, but yeah, I agree. I mean, if people want to reach out to John, do so with the intent of just telling him how wrong he is. So I love it. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, John. I really do appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. I mean, like I said, it's been, a year in the making between scheduling conflicts and things moving around and everything. So I couldn't be more happy to conclude our season then with this conversation.
Thank you, Ryan. Sorry it took so long, and hopefully we can do it again some stage in the future.
Absolutely. Love it. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes into the podcast this week and every week. And we'll see you next season. I don't owe you anything.